Hi, I'm Gary Wockner, the host of Overcoming Overshoot here on EarthX TV. I'm very excited for this episode, which we are calling Rights of Nature, Creating New Laws and Ways of Thinking to Protect the Natural World. With me today are two guests who are among the world's leading advocates for rights of nature. First is Linda Sheehan. Linda is a co-founder of the Earth Law Center. Linda has also worked for the Global Waterkeeper Alliance, the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation, and currently as the director of Environment Now, a California foundation that funds environmental protection in California and in Baja. Welcome to the show, Linda.
Thank you so much. Thrilled to be here.
And second is Corinna Gore. Corinna is the founder of the Center for Earth Ethics at Union Theological Seminary in New York, as well as being a frontline activist on the issue of climate change and a board member of the Hudson River Caper. Welcome to the show, Corinna.
Thank you, Gary. And hello, Linda.
Hey, Corinna.
And I know you've both actually been to Dallas in the past at the Earth Day festival there. So kind of welcome back to Earth Day. I mean, you probably haven't met each other, but we're all going to have a nice little chat here today.
Great.
So I like to start these shows out with what I call kind of the aha moment. We have a lot of young listeners and maybe people, sometimes they're in career changes too. And I think for activists like us to tell the aha moment of like sort of what got us into this or what made us move the direction that we did is really kind of fun and useful for people. So Corinna, do you have an aha moment or moments that sort of sparked you to spend your life and career as an environmental activist and got you into this issue specifically, rights of nature?
Well, thanks so much, Gary. And let me say I'm honored and delighted to be with both of you. I know of Linda's extraordinary groundbreaking work in this field. And I also have had the pleasure, as you noted, of being in Dallas for what used to be Earth Day, Texas, and then EarthX. So this is a really wonderful occasion to be with you. And for me, my aha moment came actually somewhat later in my life. I grew up around a lot of talk about what was called global warming and then climate change and now climate crisis because it was very much a part of my father's work. But I myself did not really go into it or see my own contribution or role. However, I was very, very much informed and concerned about the urgency of the climate crisis. And I found myself mid-career, midlife at Union Theological Seminary as a student. I now work there. But when I was a student there, I learned about the doctrine of discovery, about the history of the European presence on this land, so-called white people on this land. And that was really an aha moment for me, and I'll tell you why. Because I grew up in the wake of the civil rights movement. Union Theological Seminary is very animated by the role that religion played in the civil rights movement. And in the case of the doctrine of discovery, what I learned is that in the mid-15th century, there were these declarations called papal bulls, and they were to launch the age of discovery. And the message in them was to conquer, vanquish, and subdue all of the flora and fauna of these new lands of the Americas and Africa, so-called new lands, and that the people who were there were part of the flora and fauna. And for me, it really was like a light bulb because it connected to me. The strands of the dehumanization of Black people and Indigenous people, and the license to pillage the natural world. And as a person of European descent who grew up in this country, it also kind of made me realize how confusing and toxic it is to feel that sense of privilege, that there's some sort of divine mandate to kind of ownership and domination over this space. So I hope that's not too long-winded, but for me, that was the aha moment. And when I went into this work, I went through that doorway, and very happy to be in this movement with all of you.
Okay, Linda, now it's your turn. And you sent us a picture of the beach in Santa Monica, which reflected your aha moment. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, and first I'd like to echo Karena's thanks for being here and for hosting this incredibly important set of dialogues, not just the one we're having today, but all the work you're doing to bring these types of discussions out into the public fore. And to Karena for your work on ethics, which I'll talk about, was definitely one of my aha moments. I actually grew up in Massachusetts, and I may be dating myself here, but both the beaches and also the creek behind my house were just desperately polluted, really well before the Clean Water Act had kicked in. Sewage releases on the beaches, and in my own creek in Massachusetts, upstream tanneries would regularly belch all kinds of contaminants. And the fish that I like to watch in the creek would die. And when I was very small, I would ask the adults, the teachers, the grown-ups, why can't we fix this? And well, it's a big problem. We're not sure what to do. But I hear maybe there's some things being done, and whatever those things being done, that's what I wanted to do. So since I was a small child, those impacts of pollution in our waterways were really what inspired me. But that wasn't my only aha moment. It was just the first one. After I'd gone to work and worked for a number of years with waterkeepers, with other nonprofit organizations trying to make these waterways clean, I began to get, with my colleagues, get better at it. And with some very talented colleagues, we made together some important gains, but ultimately I felt like we were losing the war. So I started to look around and read people who wrote about ethics and environmental ethics, and Roderick Nash's The Rights of Nature, looking at the history of environmental ethics and the deep ecology movement, and trying to think, what does this all mean? And I realized for myself that the rules are rigged. The rules are set up, the environmental laws, our economic system are set up so that we will fail as environmental advocates. So we can address some of the really acute problems, like those big sewage and toxic industrial releases, but ultimately we are going to lose in with regard to the chronic problem, as we're seeing, for example, with zoonoses and COVID, but also climate change and biodiversity disappearance. So ultimately, I started to think, gosh, there's got to be other people thinking about not only human rights, but rights of the natural world. And at the time, this was about 15 years ago, there were not very many. And the people writing about ethics and philosophy were the lifeline. And so to me, that was the next moment where I needed to work to try to start. And I was fortunate to be able to help co-found Earth Law Center and take this Rights of Nature work together with other colleagues around the world and really expand it to where it is today, thriving and growing even further. So this is a great opportunity. I would have never imagined 15 years ago we could actually have a discussion like this about rights of nature. But I'm just thrilled to be able to have this conversation today.
Yeah, and I think, for some of our younger viewers and for people who maybe aren't so familiar with it, I want to sort of just get a little bit kind of elementary, if you will, and just like define what rights of nature is. So who wants to take a shot at that one?
I think Linda should.
Okay, let's have Linda.
I could give it a try, and I think it's helpful to start with what it's not, and what it's not is existing environmental law. And existing environmental law is grounded in this idea of nature as property. Fundamentally, our legal system, our economic system views the natural world, ecosystem, species, et cetera, as property. And our environmental laws, they were groundbreaking at the time, half a century ago, but they are not recognizing natural systems as having their own inherent worth, their own moral worth, and their own physical worth. And so they're always relegated to second place. So what rights of nature laws do is they recognize that nature is not just property, that natural systems are instead fraternal. Indigenous peoples have recognized this for eons, and we just forgot it when we parceled out ecosystems and species for ownership and degradation. So in order to reverse the degradation that we've caused, we need to rethink our frame and how we think about natural systems. And rights of nature laws, by allowing natural systems to have inherent rights, or to recognize the inherent rights that they enjoy, just as we humans enjoy inherent rights, that allows us to be able to behave differently on a day-to-day basis in terms of our actions towards natural systems.
Anything you want to add to that, Corinna?
I think that's wonderful, and thank you for that. I would say that the only thing I have to add is, and this is probably because my work is based at a seminary and kind of grounded through belief systems and worldviews and such, that I would see it as an acknowledgement of the intrinsic worth and value of non-human beings in the world.
And I want to raise 2 points. Although this sounds to maybe new viewers a little bit obscure, it's actually gaining traction, I think, in the United States and around the country. There was a climate council on the Democratic National Convention that proposed putting rights of nature in the Democratic Party platform before the election. They weren't completely successful, but it was sort of it was the biggest bar I'd seen that he was trying to jump over here in the United States, at least, in the mainstream political paradigm. And then it's also come up in the United Nations, and Linda, you wrote a piece about that a while back. Corinna, I listened to, you gave a talk at Tulane University a couple of years ago, and you started out your talk by saying, our nation has profoundly lost its way. And I don't know if you remember that talk exactly, but you were trying to give an introduction to this concept of rights of nature and some of the history of it. And one of the things you pointed out in there was about how laws of nature are actually in the Declaration of Independence. Tell me a little bit more about that, which I found fascinating. And I actually had to go look it up because I'm like, oh, is that really true? So tell us about that.
Well, thank you so much. I think that we're talking now, of course, in an incredible context and moment in history where we just endured this insurrection attempt in the Capitol, and so I just want to acknowledge that that is in many ways, I think the tone of that particular event was the culmination of a sense that that there is a confusion of white Christian nationalism in some cases with the foundation of this country. And to go back to the Declaration of Independence, as you pointed out, the only authority that was given to grant that was cited to grant this nation was the laws of nature and nature's God. And that was asserted as a principle, for the principle of equality of human beings. Now, we all know that we did not actually live up to that in the founding of our country, and it's taken us a while to get to the point where we are now, which is still not perfect, to include women, Black people, Indigenous people, and so on in that circle. But I think that what's important is to look at how in all of those cases, well, inalienable rights, what does that mean? Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. It assumes clean air, clean water, nourishment, food to eat. All of this is provided not by corporations that package goods, but by the earth. All wealth is derived from the biosphere. And so I think it's very important that we realize that where we are now is threatening the foundation of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all of us. And the same way that that women, that Black people were once considered property in this country, and actually the only way that the death of a slave was considered a loss of property to the slave owner rather than a homicide of a person. It is not, it's not a moral equivalent to talk about human beings and nature in many ways, but it is very useful and important to see how that thought system had to be dismantled in order to make the change to expand the circle of moral concern to include all human beings. And now we need to expand the circle of moral concern to include the natural world. It doesn't mean that the rights of rivers and trees and other species will be the same as human rights, but it means that we acknowledge their agency, volition, and right to exist and flourish alongside human beings in this land.
And Linda, in your work, you have focused a lot on, actually the actualizing of these ideas and turning them into law. And I know in a number of places in the United States and around the world, there has been a movement where laws have been passed, city councils at some states and some countries actually creating rights of nature laws. So tell us a little bit about that. Give us some examples in places. And I know there was just one in the past election in Orlando, Florida, that I think was kind of interesting. And so give us some kind of a summary of where these laws are and just the process that they got created.
Yeah, no, I will. I just wanted to respond quickly to one important thing that I think Karina brought up with regard to this idea of life, liberty, and their pursuit of happiness. And I think what's been happening is there's been sort of revisionist thinking a bit about that in recent years, and especially, unfortunately, in recent weeks, as we've been seeing that people are tending to view that from a much more individualistic lens than originally intended. This idea, the way that I read it and have studied it, and just in my own way, is that it's more about community. It was thought about more about your responsibility to community, and without your ability to be able to exercise your agency, your inherent rights, you would not be able to take care of yourself and your community as well. It's not just about your own individual sense of well-being, it's your larger sense of responsibility. And the idea of rights of nature, just like human rights, it's not specifically focused on the individual. You were just talking, Karina, about expanding the notion of community and the moral worth of life, the different humans, and as well as the natural world, extending that outwards. And it's about ultimately not just rights, but really responsibility. And that's where Indigenous peoples have understood their sense of agency and their responsibility. So this idea that you bring up, Gary, of the different laws that have been enacted to recognize the rights of nature, ultimately, I'm hoping we get to the point where the real focus is on the sense of responsibility. How do we order our lives to be able to take care of the larger community, where that includes both people and natural worlds, in a way that we are all thriving together? So with that little bit of an introduction, I want to be able to articulate that these laws are the first step. So some examples of the types of rights of nature laws that have been passed, they really span different categories of lawmaking. So courts, constitutions, national statutes, local ordinances, administrative regulatory provisions. We have seen rights of nature crop up across all of these. So a constitutional example that's well known is that in 2008, Ecuador amended its constitution through a vote of the people to recognize the inherent rights of natural systems and communities to exist and thrive and evolve. And not only was that recognized, but that also that recognition was enforced through a provision that allowed individuals in Ecuador to be able to bring lawsuits. And they have brought lawsuits since then. There have been a number of different court cases that have been won on behalf of natural systems, and also judges and administrative agencies have implemented those provisions in Ecuador. So they're getting further along. In the United States, we've seen a proliferation of local ordinances, local laws that recognize rights of nature, about 50 of them so far. And Gary, you mentioned Santa Monica earlier. That's one that I worked on, the first rights of nature law on the west coast of the United States. And that one is particularly interesting because not only did they pass a law recognizing nature's rights, they passed it not in response to a particular threat, like say a mining threat or a fracking threat, but they passed it in response to Citizens United, the Supreme Court case that came down and threatened to expand corporate rights and did expand corporate rights significantly. Santa Monica was worried that the expansion of corporate rights would prevent their community from taking care of each other, taking care of natural systems in their community. They were still wedded to this idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness in its real sense, taking care of each other. And they were worried with that pushback that this larger economic system driving the way that we think about corporations now would allow more rights for corporations than for people and natural systems. And so not only did they pass a rights of nature law back in 2013, they passed another law since then, recognizing and reinforcing the rights of groundwater in their community and banning the extraction of groundwater until they could completely by private wells until they could figure out what more needed to be done to protect groundwater. They've also since recently built that into their budget systems, into their work plans, et cetera. I think I want to leave space for other conversations, but there have been other countries like Colombia where the courts have found nature's rights where it wasn't even pled or where there are no statutes in place. India, that's happened as well. Bangladesh has had a court case. And of course, Florida, which you mentioned, Gary, was the most recent county in the United States to pass a rights of nature ordinance, Orange County, Florida, which is a very significant advancement as well.
Corinna, I know that your organization has a program. It's kind of made an effort to engage with indigenous communities to bring some of that traditional knowledge to bear in the rights of nature movement. A few years ago, I went down to New Zealand and went on a canoe trip on the Wanganui River, which was the first river on the planet to get quote unquote personhood status. And I spent a couple of days there with the Maori tribes people who helped move that forward. And it was really, it's a different worldview, you might say. And I think what your organization is trying to do in part, the Center for Earth Ethics, is to kind of set the backdrop, sort of the philosophical and the spiritual values where we can allow ourselves to make that shift in the worldview so that we can see things from a perspective where we not only have individual and personal rights, but we have a responsibility to the nature around us. So tell us a little bit about your work with indigenous communities and how you see that playing into this.
Oh, thanks for that question. And I'm glad you brought up the Wanganui River in New Zealand. Am I pronouncing that correctly?
I've heard it pronounced multiple ways. Just stick with Wanganui works, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. For those that are really new to the conversation around rights of nature, I think one question they often have is, well, shouldn't rights be only for people? And so I think what Linda was just saying is so important to remind people that in this country, we actually have personhood for corporations. And that itself is quite an ontological, to use a theological term, ontological claim about being, about what we will acknowledge as a being worthy of its own legal standing and representation. So for those that would say that it's some sort of spiritual religious idea to have a river have personhood, then they need to confront the fact that we have actually conferred that on corporations. And that is about a value system, a belief system, a worldview. And it is certainly not the only way to live on this earth as human beings. And we can see that from indigenous peoples. So 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity is in the hands of indigenous peoples, which ought to tell us something about the value of their life ways and wisdom. I'm at Union Theological Seminary, founded the Center for Earth Ethics there a little over 5 years ago. And when we started it, it was because we had a conference that was about the climate crisis. The conference was Religions for the Earth. And so historically, interreligious dialogue has been usually Christian, Muslim, Jewish, Buddhist, Hindu, and not necessarily indigenous traditions. And there are reasons for that. Some of them are good reasons, like the indigenous peoples, many of them do not self-identify as religion because institutionalized religion has been a force for bad in many cases, in many situations in the world, and has a lot of trappings around it that they don't associate with their cultural life way. But yet the traditions that these indigenous people bring include, in most cases, prayer, ceremony, all of the hallmarks of deep spiritual life and belief. And so in the course of that conference, the Religions for the Earth conference, I was very struck and deeply sort of enlightened by hearing from indigenous peoples from around the world about how they view nature and about the impact of colonization on not only their ability to relate to their own place in the natural world around them, but also in kind of demonizing and banning their own belief systems and relationship to nature. And so we, as part of the Center for Earth Ethics, we have the Original Caretakers program, very much led by our indigenous partners and friends. We really seek to learn from, engage, and honor indigenous peoples, and many people within more conventional mainstream religions, Christianity for sure, those that are waking up to the ecological circumstances that we're in, those that are really interrogating what role Christianity might have played in terms of its partnership with colonization, which started with the conversion of the Roman Emperor Constantine in the 4th century. An empire likes to extract resources. And so it really helps to promote a belief system among local people that is amenable to that. So in many ways, Christianity, although it doesn't have to do with the essence of Christianity, was distorted in that way. And there's a well-known thesis on this by a medieval historian named Lynn White, who wrote it in 1967, called The Historic Roots of Our Ecological Crisis, that says that the biggest psychic revolution in the history of humanity was the victory of Christianity over paganism. And that's in Europe. And so that is the thought system that then came into the papal bulls, which launched the doctrine of discovery, which became manifest destiny in this country, which we still live with today. And so I think when we look at where we are, where we have symbols like Mount Rushmore, and we have indigenous people saying, well, that was a sacred place for us. And we have many Americans who are trying to make sense of how our relationship to land has been influenced by religion and spirituality and the worldviews that they engender. So it's very interesting work that we do at the Center for Earth Ethics, focusing on that theological conversation and what role it has played in the ecological circumstances that we're in now.
That's kind of a nice segue, because when I came back from New Zealand and being on the Wanganui River and hanging out with those people, I kind of had two take homes. One was that it took them 175 years to change that law and to create a federal law in New Zealand, which gave right to those people and personhood status to that river, which is fascinating because, it's a long-term goal. These aren't short-term, little red hot fights that we're going to get in and just fix with the rights of nature, ordinance at the city council next week. And the second thing I learned was, okay, well, now you have this personhood status and rights of nature. What does it mean? How do you enter into the court system? How do you enforce it? Who gets to do that? Linda, I wonder, as a kind of an implementer of some of these statutes, and also, now you're involved with trying to fund some of that work too. How have you seen that sort of progress in terms of getting some kind of nitty gritty on the ground successes and where the law has been implemented? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it really needs to be thought of on a global sense. I've written a bit on how you might think about implementation in the context of the United States, which I'll talk about in a second. But to keep in mind, we have a very insular understanding of law and how law progresses if you're a lawyer or a policymaker here in the States. in many other countries, law evolves in a different way and law gets implemented differently. Different nations we've seen with rights of nature, different court systems, have learned from and referenced other nations' decisions on rights of nature and coming to their own conclusions in making decisions for how to do that. And I'll use the example of Colombia, which I brought up a minute ago. Colombia, one of the courts had a decision on a case similar to our Children's Trust here in the States, as a climate case with a number of young people. And this was what they called a tutela action in Colombia. And that it means that if your human rights are being violated, then they have a streamlined court procedure for that. And so the plaintiffs argued, that these young people argued, that their rights were being violated because of climate related issues. So they had this streamlined process, and the court added to their arguments that yes, in addition to that, the ecosystem's own rights were being violated by climate change and climate issues. And so in coming out with that decision, they didn't just stop there. They ordered the environmental ministry to move forward to implement actions to address one of the chief causes of climate change in Colombia, which is deforestation. And they set a goal for zero deforestation, and they ordered the ministry to come back with objectives in terms of how they would reach that goal. And they also ordered the ministry to go around to each of the areas where these plaintiffs were represented. They were spread geographically throughout the nation. And to hear from the community as to whether or not they were complying with these objectives in a timely way, and then invited all the plaintiffs in their communities to come back to the court on a regular basis and say, hey, are they doing their job? Are they actually implementing this? So that is an example of a court that found nature's rights and implemented them through a strategy that there was, and I talked specifically with the judge on that case when I was down in Ecuador, and he relayed that to me, and his commitment to making sure that that process was followed. Another way to think about it is the example of Santa Monica, which I brought up a few minutes ago. Not only did they pass the law, they implemented through a different groundwater law. They reorganized their environmental code within the city and prominently placed the Rights of Nature Ordinance front and center as the foundation of what they were trying to implement in terms of their environmental work. And now by integrating it through their budget processes and their work plans, which is the process they're undergoing right now, they're trying to examine sort of on a day-to-day basis, how do we operate? You know, what are our purchasing options? You know, how do we implement our laws? How do we enforce them? What are our priorities for what we do as a city? With that in mind, with not only nature's rights, but also the human right to a healthy environment in Santa Monica. And then finally, another way that we can start to think about implementation is to think about and contrast the existing laws that we do have here, for example, in the States, and offer alternatives that are more grounded in rights of nature. So for example, you know, under the Clean Water Act, there are a number of different ways to develop standards to decide whether or not you are violating the act. But they're grounded in this idea primarily of waterways to be extracted and polluted and used for human consumption. And thinking about the science, thinking about how you develop these standards, what a healthy waterway looks like from a scientific perspective that looks at it as a system instead of isolated by contaminant. There are many actors, scientists, and other partners that we can bring into this implementation discussion to really examine under our existing laws how we can begin to rethink how we're implementing them under the existing system while we are also moving forward with rights of nature laws that we can plug into later with these lessons learned from the existing laws that we have.
Corinna, I know that you in your personal and professional life have also made a bit of a transition at the seminary. You're working on more of the philosophy and the spiritual, backbone of the rights of nature movement, but you've also recently kind of jumped into the front line and gotten involved in some activist situations. And so tell us a little bit about your activism and why you've decided to do that, and then how it ties into trying to move the public dialogue forward and the law forward to protect nature and people.
Well, thank you. It's true. I have done activism and on various issues, but I would say probably have the most experience with being part of opposition to fossil fuel infrastructure build out. We've talked about the urgency of the climate crisis, and of course, one side of that is the deforestation and the depletion, the removal of the carbon sinks of our planet. And then the other side is continuing to fill the air with all of this heat trapping man-made greenhouse gas pollution, which comes primarily from the burning of fossil fuels. So one thing that I noticed is that in each of these projects where there's a pipeline that is proposed to continue out this fossil fuel system, in each individual case, there's all kinds of arguments around it, and it seems very, very complicated. And often these pipelines prevail. Yet the aggregate effect of all of them is what is going to kill life. It is harming and killing life on this planet. And so when you look down at these individual cases, and I'll start with the Dakota Access Pipeline and the Standing Rock situation, which many people were familiar with a few years ago, because that does relate to the doctrine of discovery that we were talking about before. And it also relates to environmental racism, which happens that, the number one indicator of the placement of a toxic facility in this country is the race of the people that live nearby, because of course it generates the same activity that harms our planet's atmosphere, also generates local pollution that harms people's health, in air pollution, in water pollution. Of course, there are accidents, there are explosions, there are spills, and so on. But one of the things that's interesting, to bring it back to the rights of nature conversation, is that when people are opposing these pipelines, it's not the arguments that you can marshal on the side of opposition include things like loss of tourism revenue because the forest is going to be ruined or the lake is going to be polluted. It doesn't include the actual life force of the body of water itself, that it is, as Linda has been saying, this is what we should think of as wealth, commonly shared, life-giving for now and future generations, not private property parceled up. So my activism has been to support people who are opposing these fossil fuel pipelines. I was able to join in solidarity, as were many others, with the Standing Rock Sioux in opposing the Dakota Access Pipeline. And I just want to note that was an important shift, I think, in the climate movement, because they were saying we're not protesters, we're protectors, we're water protectors. And that became a new parlance in the climate movement where people are speaking that way. I also was involved in opposing fracked gas pipelines, more in my region. And that includes the Constitution pipeline in New York State, and also something called the Algonquin Incremental Market Pipeline. Notice the names of these pipelines are always used to sort of act like, it's on the side of something good. And in that case, I was involved in an action of nonviolent civil disobedience in opposing that pipeline. And then finally, I just want to mention the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which was in the South, and where I was part of the resistance was in Virginia, where a big compressor station was going to be located in a historically Black community. And I think that the way in which the opposition was marshaled against it was very interesting. A lot of people were very interested in talking about rights of nature, because the people, and this is a community that really, if you look far back, actually it was a plantation that was located there, a slave plantation. And it was the people who were descended from the owners of the plantation that sold the land to the company Dominion. I mean, and when you talk about what we were talking about before, the distortion of Christianity, it's the notion of dominion that actually has been interpreted to mean domination, that we are here in this land to dominate, to take, because only human beings are in God's image, and this is what we are meant to do. And that's the distorted belief system that is really operating on many levels. And so the people who were descended in many cases from those who had actually been enslaved on the plantation were those that were living there, that were going to be suffering from the toxic effects of this compressor station. And many of them were voicing also arguments drawing from faith about stewardship, about caring for the earth, and also about being concerned about wildlife around there, about really, really caring for that land. And we live in a system now in which the people that care deeply for their place are often told that they have no say in what happens, because decisions made about all these projects are made by people in tall buildings looking at balance sheets who are supposed to know better than the rest of us, because they're operating according to a system that is based on economic growth, which is held up as the primary moral good. So that action, and I'm going to wrap this up, I don't mean to go on so long, sorry, was really gratifying, because the people who were resisting that compressor station in Union Hill, Virginia, were so effective that not only was the compressor station going to be put on hold, the entire Atlantic Coast pipeline, and there are other reasons for this too. There were lots of efforts at the same time. Entire Atlantic Coast pipeline was canceled. So that's an example of a victory, but they're few and far between. And as we know, mostly these projects are signed off on, and mostly you can't even make the argument about the well-being of the ecosystem itself. You have to find a way within the current law to talk about economic damages, which is something that Linda knows very, very well. And I want to thank you for your work on the legal cases and progress in that regard.
And you threw me a softball, because I want to make just a quick transition and ask one more question. It's probably a little bit harder. As an activist myself, I've started moving towards this issue of rights of nature, later than you two have, because I'm a little slower, obviously, for a couple of reasons. One is that, if you go through the traditional legal system, you can lose, and the laws are what they are, and that's all you have. And then you're just out of darts to throw at the wall. The second, though, that I really run into, especially in a place like Colorado, which is growing rapidly. And I'll lead this with a quote. It was by David Brower. I think he once said, when you're fighting to protect the environment, every victory is temporary and every loss is permanent. So there's so much growth in Colorado that you feel like, it's like this Pac-Man. It's just eating everything constantly, devouring the landscape and devouring the rivers. And so I guess a little harder question, and Corinna, you brought it up with the concept of economic growth. If either of you want to like dabble in, like, well, what about population growth and economic growth in general? Like, how can rights of nature, and I'll try to make it a little easier for you, rather than just going after population growth, but how can rights of nature kind of help us in that fight? And what can we do about it to try to turn the corner? Linda?
It's a bit of a button. So I think what rights of nature is really is trying to create a legal system that is earth focused. And this idea of development is not, as we understand it right now, is not earth focused. And that's where we're just illogical. I mean, my undergraduate degree was in engineering, and part of the attraction to rights of nature for me is the current system is just not logical. The way that we've structured it, as Corinna was just saying, is that this neoclassical economic system that we invented 200 years ago, not even that long ago, and its neoliberal overlay, which is just a few decades old, which we also invented, is somehow really, it's become almost our collective religion. It's put as the overarching thing that we all must protect, that's what must evolve, that's what we must aspire to, making better, brighter, stronger, faster. And that's just not logical, because ultimately it's the earth itself that is the overarching and all-encompassing umbrella entity. And then society, human society, is a blip on Earth radar so far. I hope we're a good blip, that we're shifting always in that direction. And then the economic system is a human construct. It's just something that we made up. And so this idea about development is really sort of the colonization of our own minds. We're so far gone that, and then myself included, that you don't really understand the frame that you're swimming in, like the fish saying, you know, what water? We don't really understand. And for me, that second aha moment that you asked about earlier was when I realized, like, I'm colonizing my own mind. I'm preventing myself from simply asking for what I want. So that I think that it's a University of Victoria law professor and environmental scientist, Michael McGonigal, who said it best. This was a great moment for me when he explained it this way. He said it's like an adjective noun problem. We as environmental advocates have structured what we think of as solutions to our environmental challenges as an adjective noun issue that's just completely flawed. So we say sustainable development, green economy, protecting natural resources, and all of these things, natural capital, all of these things, the noun reinforces the economic system, development, capital, resources. That's the overarching entity that we're, you know, paying homage to. The adjective, you know, green economy, sustainable, natural, that's what we think we're aiming towards, but in reality, it's a throwaway. The goal is the noun, and the goal is to protect the economic system. And once you start to see it from that flawed frame, you realize you've got it upside down. The goal, and this is where rights of nature laws help us think about this more clearly, the goal is, you can make up whatever goal you want since we're making all these things up. I like thriving communities, where community includes humans and natural systems thriving together, which is in fact what science shows is happening. We are interconnected with the natural systems with which we co-evolved. And we want to have economic systems and legal systems that make sure that those communities are thriving, not just sustainable. I don't even know what that means. Thriving is what, flourishing is what we should be aiming for. And trying to organize ourselves around law, like rights of nature, and economics, ecological economics is an offshoot that is starting to try to move in that direction, that recognizes the earth as the overarching entity, not the economic system. I think all of these different earth-centered substantive areas are where we are starting to help move forward to that sense of thriving communities, which is where ultimately I hope that we'll a goal that we'll be able to achieve.
And Corinna, real quick, to kind of tie to what you said earlier, because, you know, and I've been involved in some fracking fights and dam fights and all sorts of fights, and they'll always say, well, there's always more growth, there's always more growth, there's more people. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? They need oil, they need water. What are you going to do? They need food. And so how do you sort of, you know, I guess come to a place in your mind where you can wrestle with the growth question and, you know, find some kind of conclusion that allows you to, you know, work on these issues constructively?
Well, I think, I mean, in terms of population growth, I think we do need to look at that clearly, simply to contextualize the place of human beings in the natural world. The year that the Universal Declaration on Human Rights was signed in 1948, I think the population, if I'm remembering correctly, was something like 2.8 billion, and 7.8 billion today, and we've lost half forests and about half wetlands and 1 million species at risk of extinction. And yet we know that there are ways in which human population stabilizes. There are factors that have been identified, which are access to fertility management, infant or child mortality rates going down, so ensuring survivability of children, education for girls, and opportunities and power for women. And so those are also facets in this whole conversation around earth ethics. Is, you know, let's not, just because the question of human population is problematic. It's problematic because some people have talked about population growth in a racist way, and have tried to impose measures of, you know, even sterilization on people from low income, and particularly in a racist way. And so that is, of course, abhorrent. But just because that has happened doesn't mean that we can't talk about it at all. You know, we have to be able to talk about it in an intelligent, ethical way, that population growth, human population, is a factor. And we have to talk about that it's not, it's the consumers, by far the most consumption is done by a tiny percent of those human beings, you know, of which I am a member in terms of my sociological location on this planet, in my place and time, right? So speaking with humility about that, but honesty that we have to look at our levels of consumption as well as population growth, okay? Then I want to say a word about, about the, wonderful analysis that Linda has on economic growth and sustainability, which I agree with. When I was saying about the climate crisis and really trying to think about Earth ethics, I felt like there were two root causes that of the climate crisis. One was this illusion of separation between humanity and the rest of the natural world. It's an illusion that has been bolstered in many cases by religion and theology. And I've talked a little bit about that so far. It's one reason why I do this work in religion, because I think that actually even people who don't identify as religious, I think, are very much influenced by the religious roots of some of our ways of thinking about the natural world. And the second root cause, I would say, is the economic development paradigm, or the way we conceive of economic growth and the way we conceive of development. And I watched a great video, Linda, on your website of you speaking at the UN. I agreed with everything you said, and I just want to add something about why the development paradigm has developed the way it has, so that it encourages production and consumption so much. And I think it's important to remember the UN was founded 75 years ago this year in the wake of these two devastating world wars. And there was this saying that, when goods don't cross borders, armies do. There was a sense that trade and was really positive for peace building. And I think that what happened is production and consumption got kind of confused with peace building, and we really got off on the wrong track. So that now it still has this ring of a kind of moral mandate when we're talking about economic growth and trade, but everybody is waking up to the fact that it is actually destabilizing and it's counterproductive. And so I think rights of nature, this conversation is absolutely at a time in which we can introduce it in terms of those policy decision makers on the national and international levels.
If I could follow up on
Please.
if I could just follow up on your excellent points, Karen, I'd just say one more thing in addition to that, because you can see this is such a topic of great passion to both of us, is that this idea of human, we need to take care of human need first, and then we'll take care of the environment in the meantime. This idea of need is just sort of accepted implicitly, this sort of, but we never really examine the difference between need and desire. In the States, where I am, I might conflate, needs and desires, but there are many things I desire that I absolutely do not need. And Gandhi, we should have sort of just use a series of Gandhi quotes for a lot of this conversation. It's like the world has enough for people's need, but not enough for people's greed. And I think that if we actually start to think about thinking about rights of nature, nature doesn't have desires, nature has needs. And if we start to learn from indigenous peoples, listen to nature, learn from nature, how is it that we can alter our lives to have just what we need and not necessarily what we desire. I mean, nobody sort of thinks at the end of their life, gee, I wish I played more with all of the toys that I accumulated in my life. You think, no, I wish I'd spent more time with the people in the community that I love. And that element of need is one that our economic system does not value. It's marginalized. And in addition to food and water and housing and energy, which we need to make sure that people's needs are absolutely met, we also need to think about those other needs as well, and reject the types of desires that the economic system is ginning up for us to be able to pursue.
Okay, we are out of time, and I could have had this conversation all afternoon. It's been just incredible talking to both of you. You know, I actually think that we should try to bring you both back at some other time and just continue the dialogue here about rights of nature on EarthX TV, because I think this issue is growing and growing dramatically around the United States and beyond. And also, I'm starting to do more work in this professionally too. And, you know, I'm the host of the show, so I get to talk about mostly what I want. So we're going to talk about rights of nature more often here, I think. So Corinna, thank you for being on the show on Overcoming Overshoot. And Linda, thank you for being on Overcoming Overshoot. And thank you to the viewers for watching Overcoming Overshoot here on EarthX TV.